This episode is brought to you by The Venture Project. Venture Project is a business incubator and co-working space in the fabulous Osh Vegas, Wisconsin. However, we do remote consults. We also travel all over the country. So if you guys have a business idea or are interested in participating in the Venture Project community, please go to theventureprojectoshkosh.com where you can learn more about me and the Venture Project itself. Once again, this is theventureprojectoshkosh.com. All right, folks, welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews podcast. I'm your host, AJ Armstrong, and today's guest, we have Justin Nassiri. Now, Justin is a Stanford MBA and also a Navy grad. Yes, United States Naval Academy. I've got to give him a little Go Army Beat Navy for having that go on today. But he is a fantastic entrepreneur, wonderful man, and he had a really insightful discussions on several of his really impressive startups. One we talked specifically about is Captivate.ai. Now, I actually have heard about Captivate.ai because this is exactly what we were looking for a while ago, optimizing long-form content for social media. But not only has Justin exploding with this current startup, he has also had successful exits and transitions with other startups in the world of entrepreneurship. So he digs into a lot of these stories today. I was really excited to have him on where we could discuss not only his business tactics, but also some personal growth and development tactics that he partakes in on a daily basis. He's also, I think, which is definitely worth noting, a very popular podcast in the veteran circle, which is Beyond the Uniform. It's actually #1 rated podcast on iTunes for military career transition. So he's had people like Jocko Willink. He's also had some other famous military leaders jump on his podcast and share insights about the transition into the civilian force. So I encourage you guys to go check that out also after you listen to this episode, of course. So without any further ado, welcome to the show.
Welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews, the only show that's going to teach you how to be somebody.
Where in your life did you learn that you're not good enough?
And how do you take what you're most passionate about and what you're most fearful of, and what is the plan to overcome that fear, and what is the plan to enact that passion?
Well, Justin, I know we're just kind of rolling into things, but I know we just kind of connected on this Army-Navy rivalry we got going on here. But give me a little bit of your backstory and how it kind of rolled in. We'll talk podcasting, talk about just life as an entrepreneur. You've got a really stacked resume. It's really impressive. And I think that you'll have a lot of things to share with our listeners who are entrepreneurs, who are leaders in the business community. And I just wanted to know where it kind of started for you, where you grew up and what you were kind of like as a kid.
Yeah, it's funny. I was at the park yesterday. I have a 2.5-year-old son, and I don't know what the event was going on, but this marching band came across the park we were at. And I texted my brother. I'm like, dude, there's this marching band that's coming across here. I'm like, I cannot believe that was like a big part of my life growing up. And so I grew up, I was like a band kid. I didn't really do athletics, and ironically ended up going to a service academy just like you, where athletics became a really big part of my life. So I guess as a kid, probably pretty introverted, probably pretty academic, and went to the Naval Academy, which for me was a life-changing experience, just getting exposure to a lot of different backgrounds. And as you can probably relate to, at 18 years old, having a pretty big sense of purpose instilled in me, where everything was pretty clear. Like I had a clear mission, which was to protect our country and to lead in some way and to contribute and to be selfless. And out of the academy, chose to go into submarines and spent 5 years on nuclear submarines doing that, and walked away with a sense of loving the teamwork, loving leading, loving doing things and solving problems. But I knew after 5 years, and I wouldn't get married for another 10 years, but knew at the time, I'm just like, man, I can't imagine having kids doing this. I just can't imagine being away from them. Fast forward now where I have a 2.5-year-old, I completely respect those who serve our country in that way, but I just cannot imagine being away with him for 6 months at a time. It's like so unpalatable for me. So I decided to get out, and I'm curious what your transition was like, which is the subject of my own podcast, but I had no clue, absolutely no concept what I would do when I'd get out. And so I did what a lot of people did. And I said, look, I like managing people. Who knows what that looks like in the business world, but it probably has to do something with business. So let me go to business school, and was lucky to get into Stanford and went there and met crazy people. And it was my first exposure to startups. And it's embarrassing to admit that, but I never really thought about where big companies come from. And it turns out they come from one or two people who have a crazy idea and break through walls to bring it to life. And that's what I ended up doing out of business school, was starting a tech company and making so many mistakes and getting so many battle scars. But 10 years later, I'm still an entrepreneur, which is another conversation, and still really enjoy the art of creating something new and solving new problems on a daily basis.
I know a lot of professionals that have come from Stanford that moved into the startup community, but there's this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's my parents in the back corner, they say you're a West Point grad or you're a Navy grad and you went to Stanford now for your MBA. You could get a job anywhere in the entire world with whatever salary you want. And instead you choose to go into, I want to create something myself. Tell me a little bit about that decision and what inspired you to do that.
I really wish we had a beer between us right now, because the story that I glossed off of was when I wrote my applications for Stanford. Like, my sense is that like a lot of people write their applications saying they want to be an entrepreneur, and then a lot of them go on and do something else. And I was the opposite. I said, look, I know nothing about business. I'm going to go to Stanford. I'm going to go to a top 3 consulting company. I'm going to learn what business is, and then I'll figure it out. And so I interned in New York with one of the best consulting companies, McKinsey and Company, and I accepted an offer from them. And that was it. I was going to go do that. And this was 2009. The economy tanks. I go from graduating in July, and I have until February of the following year before I start with McKinsey. They gave me like a $30,000 signing bonus. I've got 9 months to do whatever I want. And like most veterans, I don't like to be idle. And so I just started running with a business idea and started working on it, and got to the point that by December, and this was at the time a big crisis of conscience for me, because I'd gone to the Naval Academy. There's this thought of like, my word is my bond. I told them I'd go work with them. And I had all these conversations with people about, I don't want to go there anymore. I want to go start a company. And I'm so grateful I got advice from other veterans saying like, look, man, you haven't swore another oath to McKinsey. They gave me good advice there. So I went to them and I'm like, look, I may regret this. I may be begging you for a job 3 months from now, but I love what I'm doing. And whether it's starting my own company or working at another startup, I know there's something here that's calling to me. And coincidentally, a few weeks later, I got my first round of funding, but I did not know that at the time. I didn't even think that was a possibility. So I just shared that because I feel like oftentimes we are told that entrepreneurs would never work at a big company. They would never do things. I'm an example of someone who thought I was going to go to a big company. I thought I was going to do consulting, and it just worked out that entrepreneurship landed for me. So for people listening, like, I think there's still a sore spot for me of all the people that told me like, oh, if you're going to be a consultant, you're not going to be an entrepreneur. Or if you'd even think of working at a company like McKinsey, you're not an entrepreneur. And like, for your audience, I would just say like a big F that. Like, anyone who tells you what entrepreneurs should or shouldn't be, or what they look like or sound like, or what their backgrounds are, like, this path is for people who want to forge their own way, and don't listen to anyone who says you have to look like a certain way.
I want to emphasize that point a little bit, because and I've talked about this on our show. I had an episode, I called it Corporatepreneur, because we look at the world, like a lot of entrepreneurs in the entrepreneur community look at it just like what you were kind of explaining. You're either an entrepreneur or you're going to go get a job. And I don't think it's necessarily that black and white. I think a great example is what you see in kind of like how Hollywood and a lot of the business runs there, where you'll have kind of people with a personal brand, their own business, that get hired on by companies to do things from a contracting basis or on a salary. And then they go back and work on their own. It just kind of like fluctuates a lot more freely. And what you really start to notice is these are business leaders. These are people that have a certain style of skill, and they can fluctuate between the two. And it's just the world of business. And I don't like how people think you're either an entrepreneur or you're in corporate. And I think you could do both. You could do one or the other. You could do a little bit of either, and you could jump in and out. A great example is another woman I know. She used to work on her own for years, 20 years as an entrepreneur. And then she ended up getting hired as a consultant at this company from her company. And then she was working with them so long, she eventually they offered her a salary that was a better deal for her. It was more consistent and some other things, and it was a big salary. And it's like, does that mean she wasn't an entrepreneur that whole time? I mean, this is like, it starts to blur the line. So I like how you emphasize that, like, yeah, there's different kind of styles of business people. And that's really all it is to me, I think.
I love that. And I think that those examples are good examples because I think that who we are and what we want change over time. And I wish looking back on myself 10, 15 years ago would have seen that there's just seasons of life where you want to cultivate skills or invest in different ways. And I think that we can get into trouble when we view ourselves in black and white terms, and say like, I'm an entrepreneur, so I won't do this, or I'm not an entrepreneur, I won't do this, rather than just like moment to moment, what excites me and what best matches what I'm wanting out of life right now.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I also want to ask you too a little bit about, it sounds like you were kind of working with a startup idea and then you got some investments up front that kind of supported it. Was that kind of the first time that validated this idea? How did you know you were on the right track, or what did that look like for you? Because I think that's tough for a lot of people, because in the community of entrepreneurs, there's this persistence is everything. Well, obviously you could run your face into a concrete wall and it's not going anywhere. But then there's this other side that, like, you don't want to give up too soon. You see the meme with the guy that's digging for gold and it's just right behind the other corner. And I think that's a really complicated dilemma for people to figure out, where is the path to success going to be? And I'd like to get your insight on that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'll try to give a nuanced answer, but one thing I like to share is that it was so lonely in those first 9 months. And I remember, especially right out of business school, like this cannon, you shot out of a cannon and everyone's going on to these great things. I remember I'd go to dinner parties and friends of friends I'd be meeting for the first time would ask me what I do. And it was just kind of like I'd explain it and I'd get blank looks. And oftentimes they'd turn to whoever's sitting next to them because invest time wisely. And then when I raised money, it was from Eric Schmidt's fund. Eric Schmidt was the CEO of Google at the time. And after that, I would give the exact same description of what I'm doing. And I'd end it by saying, like, I just raised money from Eric Schmidt. And they're like, oh, it's such a great idea. And it just planted this seed in my mind that, like, obviously people are not all successful venture capitalists. They don't know what a great idea is. And usually people don't know what to do with you if you're not a brand name. Most people don't know what to do with small companies.
Yeah. And
my pride would get bruised too, where I would say I was an entrepreneur and someone would say, like, they'd equate me to having like a newspaper route, not to denigrate newspaper routes, but it's just kind of like there's a huge psychological toll of going on your own for so long.
Yeah.
But more to your point, I wish what I would have done earlier on is be really clear with what my hypothesis was and how I was going to test that, and then just constantly reevaluate it. Because then the opinions of others and like my own sense of this is a great idea become less meaningful. And it's more of just about experiments. Like, I believe I can solve this problem and people will pay me to do it. Okay, let me start to gather data. Will people pay me to do it? If not, what's not working and how can I continue to refine? So more as a science experiment rather than what I approached it with was a lot coming from the military was like, I'm just going to break down walls and keep on beating against this until it works. It's an asset, but also a liability versus having the maturity to kind of step back and say, like, okay, I'm deluding myself thinking that this is worth breaking down this wall. What can I adapt to? Who's a market that would benefit from my product, or what's a different product that I could sell instead? And so it's something that's very top of mind with my current company, Captivate, is like, I don't want to be drunk on my own Kool-Aid. I want to be measured and realistic and knowing that I'm just doing experiment after experiment to prove something out. And if that continues to go well, the company will succeed. But if not, I need to be able to drop everything I'm doing and pivot on a dime. It's like in those spy movies, when they're like, you got to be willing to walk out the door and leave everything behind you. I feel like as entrepreneurs, we have to be like that. If like there's a bigger business opportunity, Who cares if you spent 5 years developing a product that no one wants? Who cares if you've spent all this emotional energy? The moment you identify the bigger opportunity, you have to be willing to pounce on that, because that's how great companies are made.
Yeah, it's just kind of like the proverbial statement in our military circles of cutting the sling load of a helicopter when your load goes wrong. It's time to sometimes cut their losses. I love this idea of how you look at it like a science experiment. You look at it like a hypothesis. You're testing things to see if it's in line with what you're trying to test. I want to dig into that for just a moment. What it sounds to me is progress indicators. For you, sometimes when you're looking in a startup or you're starting something, what are the things like, I want this to look like this at a certain point, or it's an indicator we might be on the wrong track. I want it to look like this at a certain point. What are those things that are your progress indicators for you?
That's a great question as well. And I'll just full disclosure, as I hear you describe it in that way, I'm like, man, I wish I was more like that, because I do so often go off of my gut feel, and I'm trying to build in more of this measured approach. I recently, and this is after doing a lot of sales, I recently finally went from a spreadsheet into, I use Pipedrive for my CRM. And I wish I would have done that earlier. But it's now that I've got it all organized, it's very easy for me to see like, oh man, I'm getting a lot of momentum. Like I've got a lot of conversations and I assign dollar values based on the product I'm selling. So I can actually see like, wow, we're kind of on the cliff of reaching a new revenue milestone. So that for me right now is the biggest one. And that could be meetings held, people who are interested, proposals sent, but it's just a helpful pulse for me to say like, okay, I had 40 meetings this week and I had 30 last week. Like that's a good trend. So for me, I try to make it about money. And that's not because I'm superficial, but it's because in the last decade as an entrepreneur, so often I would hear positive feedback and get excited by that, or hear investor interest and get excited about that. And that's kind of meaningless. Like unless an investor is writing a check and unless a customer is willing to pay, their excitement is just noise. And so I try to back it into, where's my revenue? How is that growing over time? And there's activity-based indicators, right? How many emails did I send out? How many meetings did I have? But ultimately, it's how much revenue did I generate this month? And how does that compare to last month? And that's, to me, kind of the only two things that matter. That I'm generating money and that I'm generating more money this month than last month.
Obviously, that makes a lot of sense, especially for a business, right? That's our goal, is kind of to drive profitability. Bringing it to like maybe a startup in pre-revenue, I think that's a difficult time because you have no validation at that point. And most startups don't have that. They have their friends that either think it's a stupid idea or a great idea. And to your point, they don't know what a good idea is. You've got your parents that don't understand why you're doing this with an MBA from Stanford. You know, it's just like you've got all these players in here and there's no real way to get market validation, or is there? And I think that's my question to you is like, so if you're a pre-revenue startup or a very early stage business, what are some of those things that are like, hey, I think I'm on the right track? You mentioned you do a lot with kind of your gut intuition, but if you could break that down into something, what are you kind of looking at?
So two things. The first thing, and definitely take this with a grain of salt, because I've given this advice to a lot of entrepreneurs who have been much more successful than me and ignored it. So it's certainly not a truth. But my advice is actually, you got to get to revenue way before you're ready to.
Yes.
And an example I love, a friend of mine, John Beekman, started a company called Man Crates. And when he first had the idea for these wooden crates with a crowbar that men would open and there'd be like video games and stuff inside, when he first had that idea, he ran Facebook ads to a fake e-commerce site and literally had people buy it. It didn't exist. He would refund their money and call them up immediately and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. It doesn't actually exist. Can I ask you 5 questions? So what I love about that was like, even before he had a product, he was basing it off of sales, off of willingness to pay. And with Captivate, I invested $5,000 of my money last year and have bootstrapped it to where it is right now. And part of the reason I did that was I was like, I got to find a way to solve a big enough pain point right away that people will pay me for. Like, and that's one of the things I love about bootstrapping is that forces you to generate money very quickly. So that's the first thing that I'd say is that, and I know that that's has a tendency towards software, but I've known real estate people who started with consulting, who just literally would advise and use that to generate money, and then they'd have money to invest. So like it could be services business as well. So that's the first piece of advice. But the second piece of advice is like, I've learned, and this took me 10 years to learn this, I've learned I'm not the best strategy person. And I have 3 or 4 friends who are much smarter than me and can think around corners and are able to look at the big picture. And I make sure that I'm meeting with one of those people every month. And that's just because in the areas that are more speculative in my business, I really rely on their brain power to say like, oh, this pivot makes sense. This is a better business for these reasons. And there are investors that have that skill set. And I just realized I don't really have that. So I would say that if you are pre-revenue and you can't get around that, find people who are external to your business, who are not drunk on the Kool-Aid, who are smart, who can point out the mistakes you're making or validate what you're doing. Because I just don't trust myself. In absence of revenue, I don't really trust myself that much to realize that I'm pushing in the right direction.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I couldn't agree more with you on that style of looking at a business. I mean, for like before, so we started the venture project back in January, and it's our incubator and co-working space. And I was a big believer in kind of the lean startup, minimum viable product, try to find the lowest barrier to entry to get some cash coming in to show there's a market. And I've always kind of taught, my friends and other entrepreneurs and some of my clients that same method. Now, when we started the venture project, I wanted to do the whole thing on that bootstrapping strategy. It was just like, how can we just throw some money, like barely anything? We used furniture that was already in here. I did a lot of the work myself. We found equipment that we already had. I got literally everything off of Facebook Marketplace at virtually nothing. I found liquidation sales for things. We have a 7,500 square foot office space. It looks like a 1920s Art Deco, like interior design beautifully, because there was 1980s wallpaper, and we just used I found one of my friends, she's really creative, and was able to pull it all together. And the long and the short of it is, we were able to basically spend $40,000 to increase the value of the property and the business itself up to $750,000 because of that mentality. And I'm not going to put a $500,000 investment into this if I don't know if people want to rent space here or participate in our programs. You don't know that. And what we found out right off the bat was these are the spaces people are spending money. I'm like, great. People really liked the podcasting aspect of our business. So what did we do? We took the profit and started pushing it at upgrading our studio, upgrading equipment, these types of things. And that's, I think, better, because I would have pissed the money away on something else totally unrelated. But now they're telling me where to reinvest because I'm seeing the information come through.
100%. And again, for me, there's this tension. So like when I raised a $2 million round with my company Storybox, I lost that scrappiness. Like I lost that, and I started building speculative products rather than validating, and just gave me room to be sloppy. And I'm about to raise money again. The balance I'm trying to strike is like, how do I keep that attitude that you just described? How do I keep that mentality for 80% of what I do? But then how do I shift gears for myself and allow myself to deploy money? Like right before this, I just hired an accountant, and I've been doing our QuickBooks up until now. But it's like that realization of like, I got to just spend money to like save myself time and have this done right. And I feel like that's one of the tricky spots that we have as entrepreneurs, is like, the way that we behave to get to a certain point isn't necessarily what will take us to the next level. And so my intention is to preserve that scrappiness where it makes sense, but also to buy expertise or buy time savings and convenience for myself where it doesn't. And knowing the difference can be really difficult.
That is an interesting point and a difficult question too, because once you start getting a little bit of money, you want to spend it, right? And it's like, well, do we need to spend it on this, or what's a better place to spend it? And really the art of, I think, one of the main aspects of a successful entrepreneur is how can you look at the microfinances and reallocate them, and like to where even at the $10 mark, it's always buy low, sell high, always buy low, sell high, everything, right? So if you're looking at the furniture, the painting, everything I ever buy, I try to look at as, this is buy low. How am I buying this for the best deal possible? And can I return the asset out later? Is this improving the value of this aspect in any way? Am I adding value to the members? Am I adding value to the building? And I try to look at everything that way. And that's what I've found to answer that question. But that's hard because like one of my employees, I have 4 employees and we're thinking of hiring another one. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that because that's really expensive. What do we really need? And when I broke it down, we were just looking for basically an assistant to run like the admin in the space and stuff. Like probably one of the first things we should have done here at a co-working space. But I'm like, I can find software that automatically unlocks the doors. I can find software that has camera systems, and I can find things that people can buzz and come to hang out with me if I'm around or someone else. And we figured out for like $1,500, we could just automate that role because we were thinking of it. But what if I would have spent $3,000 every month for the next how many years to do something that we could have just done a one-time payment to automate? And that saved me so much money. But the great news was like, we didn't have that much money to spend. So I'm like, that was kind of how I try to think of it. So it's almost like you have to hide money from yourself in a way. You know what I mean?
Yep. Oh, for sure. It is these like mind games. I like the thought of like even hiding money from yourself. And I have to remind myself too of like the times in my first company when we moved offices, I went in on a Saturday and spent like 12 hours putting together IKEA chairs. Yeah. And I'm like, what a stupid use of my time. Like I could have paid someone to do that for a couple $100. And so it's like, it's that delicate balance of like being scrappy, but also being judicious with your energy and attention and time. But I love what you described, which is like, what are systems or turnkey softwares that can take the place of people to just not have another headcount, which brings with it headache of overseeing someone and maybe you get the fit wrong or whatever else it is.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you're working on now with Captivate. You said you kind of threw $5,000 at this and it was a bootstrap effort from then. Walk me through that process. What was that like for you and kind of how did that grow?
So let me start with where we're at today. So the company is called Captivate.ai and we do 2 things right now. The first is essentially the realization that I started with the company was saying, look, companies are doing podcasts and webinars and they get 10% of the value because only so many people are going to listen to an hour podcast or watch an hour webinar. And yet there's great content there. So why don't we take the video from these conversations and slice and dice it in a way where they have a month of content. They've got Instagram Reels, YouTube videos, LinkedIn posts, blog posts. And the thing that I loved was realizing no one wants to sit and write a blog post. But what you and I are doing right now, like it's so energizing. Like I love doing this, but I will never write a blog post. But we could turn this conversation into 3 to 5 blog posts very easily. So that's what we do. That's part of what we do. The second part is we take executives who want attention, we get them on podcasts, and we run the same playbook. So you had in episode 133, you met with Alec Watson. He talked about visual marketing. And I loved this because he was talking about he wanted to get content out faster rather than focusing on nice cinematic pieces. I think it was you that you said, will the content be captivating enough? And I just wanted to call out you. You literally used our name in that piece as you guys were talking about this content repurposing. But where it started was I still do a podcast. I'm 410 episodes in, and I had this idea. And so I just started meeting with friends who ran companies, and I met with a lot of them, maybe 20. And I found 2 that were like, yes, we could do this. We want to give you a shot. I think one of them I did it for free. And I just hustled on my own and I was doing a lot of the video editing and I was looking for the content and I was using Airtable to deliver it. And I just kind of like hacked together this minimum viable product. And I got so much feedback in doing that. One of our clients was like, look, it would be so helpful if I could just click and watch the video rather than this Airtable that you're doing. And so hired someone on Upwork to build a platform that would do that. And it was just baby steps. It was like literally, I will do 100% of this. And then when a customer writes me a check, I will find the discrete piece that I can give to someone else. But I'm still doing 95%. But now I got another check, so I'm going to do 90%. And so it literally became excruciatingly tiny steps. But like you said, every piece as I was building Captivate was like, what is the guts of the business here? Where do I know I will benefit from spending more money? And then started to generate more and more money and started to build more technology to offload my plate. But like literally got to a point where I was spending 80% of my time supporting customers and then invested, 10 grand in software and systems that got it down to like 5% of my time. So it was this act of like tolerating discomfort and doing so much more, like stuff so far below my pay grade, the equivalent of taking the trash out and doing the dishes. And I did that and ate shit for months and months. But the nice thing of doing that was like I was able to build a process. I knew how it should be done and then architected a solution to get that off my plate or hired someone around that. And so that's kind of how I've gotten to this point. And it's funny because for a long time, I've said I never wanted to raise money again. And here we are. I think we've got a big opportunity and I think I'd benefit from bringing money on. So we'll have to do another conversation. Maybe I'll have you on my podcast once we've done that, because I'm sure my philosophy will change slightly. But I do like this sense, and I'm blanking on the name of the book, but the premise is basically you do a sales rep's job until you can write a process that anyone could follow. Mm-hmm. You hire someone to follow that process. And guess what? You are now promoted to sales manager and you need to write the process and do that until you can hire someone to take sales manager. And then you get promoted to the next thing. That's the philosophy I've been following, which is do everything, figure out a better way to do it, hire someone to take it over. And then you got to put out another fire.
I think that is a fantastic way of looking at it. One thought that came to mind, I've worked with some startups or entrepreneurs that are so excited about designing the process before they're even really selling anything or before they're really doing that role. And I think when you put it in the position of like, you're the sales guy first, like what that forces you to do is find that market piece that you're looking for. You're trying to get into the market and then I can sell this. Boom. Now let's figure out what we're going to deliver. I mean, you work with any software company, that's what they do, right? Even the big ones like PTC, they'll come into a company and we can do that, we can do this, we can do that. And then they just quick scramble back to their systems engineers and they say, hey, this is all the stuff we got to do. Can we do that? And they're like, I don't know, maybe. And then it's like, no, and they just basically invent the product as with their team as they're going out and finding need. And that kind of is what that method does for you, is if you're like, I'm first the sales guy, I got to go find this market need, and forces you to say, I'm going to not think about my product as much as what the problem I'm solving, at least first. I don't know if you see that a lot with people or not, but it seems like people get really in love with their product before they really think, is this really helping anything?
And I, with my company Storybox, I love the phrase, you have to love your customer more than your product. And my company Storybox started as a company called Video Genie, and we were all about video. We got repeated feedback from our customers that they wanted photos, and I ignored it because I'd raised a lot of money and I had a product that was making money. And another company came along and solved that problem and sold for $135 million. So like I have a very visceral reaction to that. And that's one of my commitments with Captivate is like, how do I remain empathetic to my customers and what their pain points are? Being 15% more empathetic than anyone else is a competitive advantage. That's what my executive coach shared with me. And I love that. And it's like something that I need to continue to remind myself of, which is like, I described what Captivate is doing right now. If our customers tell us that there's a bigger pain point that would serve them better, I need to be willing to go there. And I think about that, like literally, as I was talking to one of our developers today, as I'm thinking of features to build in the back of my mind, it's like still baby step features. It's like, what's the little bit that we add today? Because this thing might go out the window tomorrow as we pivot to what the bigger opportunity is. So it's this, again, this contrast of like being quick, but also not being so, not polishing the Titanic if there's a better opportunity.
Yeah, I love the idea of what you're doing with Captivate. I mean, I think just being a podcaster, doing a lot of stuff with video, I mean, I travel to different areas and speak, and then they film it. And it's like, if there was something out there that could just consolidate the golden nuggets without having to pay a video editor to sit there for an hour to listen through the whole thing. But if you could almost give them a highlight reel and they could take the highlight reel and it just automatically, it's just, that is where I think the growing demand is going to be in the market. What do they do in Hollywood? I don't know. You watch these documentaries on Netflix. How many people sit there all day and just dig through footage? That just seems like a horrendous waste. And I think nobody probably enjoys that. So it just seems like it'd be a great need to fill.
What excited me too was like, so first of all, exactly what you said. We are increasingly impatient as people. Twitter, TikTok, like the attention span is getting smaller and smaller. And so how do you feed people in the way they want to be fed? So that's giving them that sizzle, giving them the highlights. But what excited me that's on the flip side of that is for my podcast, I have one number, downloads. That's all I know. How many people listen to my podcast? But as I followed this strategy of slicing it up, instead of one data point, I get 30 to 50. I get discrete messages where I'm like, oh man, it seems like people are really responding to topics about resilience, or they're really responding to minimum viable product. Maybe I should do more of that. So it just gives me so much more information about what messaging is working, what different guests I could bring on, what I could build out in a completely different way for advertising. So that data piece really excited me.
So what do you think the future of like the whole digital marketing space is? Because I agree with that. You're getting now more information on what exactly people are looking at. And being a podcaster myself, downloads, I think I just haven't discovered no pattern to that at all. It's like
sure.
Subjects you thought were going to hit, just hit. I don't know if it's the way that iTunes and Spotify push certain things. No idea what it does, right? So that's been a mystery to me. And to your point, being able to take that and repurpose it, what do you think is kind of the emerging space for where to put more of your effort in the digital marketing world? Because I think that's always the hot topic. And we're always like 2 steps behind because, oh, no, TikTok's a thing. Well, that's been a thing for 3 years. Like, yeah. And I think it's about asking those questions. In your opinion, where do you think is the place to emphasize?
So I'll give advice, but I want to be clear that this is kind of advice for companies that have 10 or more employees, 20 or more employees, because I'm not that big yet. And I struggle to follow the advice I'm going to give everyone. So for companies that are large enough, so often they're coming to me and they're saying like, well, we just post on LinkedIn. And my answer to them is always like, look, I get that a lot of your customers are on LinkedIn. I guarantee you, even if you're a biotech company, some percentage of your customers are on Instagram, some percentage are on YouTube, some are on Facebook. Like the truth is, you've got customers everywhere. And so you need to be everywhere. And it's the tiny actions that you take today that are going to build an empire a year from now. And so I'm always encouraging our clients to say, look, if you follow the strategy we're prescribing, it's going to be easy for you to be publishing content on every social channel, every day of the week even, or multiple times a day, or multiple times during the week. And you can build up audiences everywhere. And that portfolio of people is going to be something quite big. So that's kind of the biggest thing that I would say, which is that if you're less than 20 employees, I get it. Like focus on one channel. You really have to kind of just make every bullet count. But once you clear a certain threshold, you have to be thinking more beyond just tomorrow. Like LinkedIn and sales outreach is what's keeping me alive today. But as we grow, I need to be everywhere. I need to be thinking about SEO optimization, which is going to take 6 months to pay off. I need to be publishing a lot of videos on YouTube because I know a year from now, people are going to search for stuff and find me. So if you're in that stage where you're not just worried about keeping the lights on, I would recommend like you got to be everywhere. And as much as we hate TikTok coming along and whatever comes after that, some of your customers are going to be there. So you need to take advantage of that. And the only way to do that is if you're following a playbook like we have, which is efficient creation of highly engaging content tailored to each channel.
Yeah, 100% agree. Well, Justin, I really appreciate, this conversation and how far we've come with just, 40 minutes of discussion. I wanted to throw it back at you. Is there anything in particular you're working on right now that you'd like to get out there, or people could connect with you or, enjoy Captivate a little bit? What do you got going on?
Yeah, the biggest thing that's new for us is this podcast guesting. And it comes from this pain point of, as a CEO myself, it's so hard to get attention. And so what I'm really liking with our new product is how we're working with CEOs, CMOs of 20 to 200 person companies. We're helping them get on the best podcasts that their audience is listening to. We're helping them convert that into all of this micro content to distribute across their social channel. We're helping them read the tea leaves of analytics and help them understand what's working, and then using that knowledge to tweak the podcast they're going on and the content that they're publishing. So that's the one thing I would just highlight for people that are interested. You can find us at captivate.ai. And of course, if you do webinars, if you do podcasts, would love to help you repurpose that to get more value from it.
What's some parting wisdom you might have for people out there that may be pre-revenue, they may be in idea phase, or they might be looking just to kind of grow in their personal life or aspects? What do you think has been a message that's come back to you time and time again that would be helpful to share with them?
Two things. The first is take care of yourself financially, physically, in every way. In my first startup, I was out of shape, in debt. I just really did not take care of myself. When I raised my first round, my lawyer was like, hey, you should take some money off the table. And I was like, no, I want all the equity. This is going to be so big. And I really regret that I didn't take money out. And our investors offered to pay me said, hey, you just raised money. This is what you think your salary should be. And I took half that salary. I'm like, no, I'm going to save money and be a scrappy entrepreneur. And it was just not taking care of myself. And so I say that for entrepreneurs listening, like, pay yourself a good salary. Like, don't have your success be something that's 5 years in a way. And if you knock it out of the park, you're going to be happy. But if you don't, you're going to be poor. And so with Captivate, it's something I'm trying to think about every day, which is like, okay, let me pay myself a good salary so I'm not putting my family at risk right now. And let me make sure that I'm exercising every day. And let me make sure that I'm eating well. Like, I want to be in this for the long term. That's the second piece. Is just, I find a cancerous piece of feedback that is very sexy around hustling, around working nonstop. And just do this for yourself. Like, I look at the biggest realizations I've had in my professional career. None of them came in the office. They came when I was running. They came when I was grabbing a drink with a friend. They came when I was like at night reading a magazine. Like, we are creative beasts and we need time to restore ourselves creatively. So don't buy into this mindset of like grind down to the bone at all cost. That will work for the short term, but that's not a way to win a marathon. And that's what entrepreneurship is. It is a marathon.
Yeah, I can't see more eye to eye with you on everything we've really talked about. I mean, from just the scrapping together a business at the micro level all the way to what you just mentioned and being able to kind of have that balance. Because I always tell a story on the podcast when I was actually down in St. Lucia on vacation, and I get like, just chilling there, drinking a Mai Tai or whatever. And I'm just getting all these ideas that end up getting incorporated into my business that end up paying off the vacation, other things. And I always joke with my family. I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely going to write off these vacations. This is an investment because look at what happened when I went to St. Lucia, and
for sure. For sure.
And it's exactly what you're talking about. Like when you're traveling, you're at the airport, you're grabbing a drink with a buddy or a friend. Like I went to an Eric Clapton concert last weekend. I got all these ideas about stuff. I don't know if I'm going to do anything with them, but I love that you emphasize that. I agree. I think that there's a right amount of hustle, but you can also hustle yourself in a circle, right? And you can also just hustle yourself into the ground and just dry up. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, to summarize what you just had said, is this idea of mitigating your downside in a lot of ways, like being able to kind of take care of yourself, pay yourself a salary, not just hustle yourself into a corner or go all in without some kind of good strategy for a plan B. I think we get a lot of like the burn the boats kind of, mentality that works for some people, I think, when you really see a clear path to the end. But for people that are just kind of in that, I think this is a cool idea. I mean, look, just take care of yourself. And before you decide to invest your whole world into this thing, make sure you get a little validation or a little bit of a path forward.
I mean, you said it so succinctly, mitigate your downside. I think that's the best way that I could put it is like, if it works great, of course you're going to be happy, but just make sure that if things don't work out 2 years from now, you're still happy with that too.
Yeah. And I think a former military officer, we're trained in when you're planning the enemy's course of action, you're planning the most likely course of action, and you're also planning the most dangerous course of action. And I think that is something to look at in the business world as well, is this probably won't happen, but if it does, it could be catastrophic. So let's just make sure we got some kind of contingency in place.
Yeah.
Hey, this was a fantastic conversation today, Justin. I really appreciate having you on the show. And you guys are listening to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews podcast. Winners, people that are really crushing it in life. Wallets, talking about small business, entrepreneurship, finance. And then finally, Worldviews, talking about all of those values and things that drive us to get there. So thank you again, Justin.
Thank you.